Welcome to the Global Connection, a Tel Aviv University podcast. Journey with us as we discover how TAU's academic community and friends are engaging with and helping to shape this ever-changing world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Global Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Anna Sajecki, and I am privileged to be joined by award-winning Israeli-Canadian writer Ayelet Tsabari, who is the author of the 2016 short story collection, The Best Place on Earth, which won the Sammy Rohrer Prize for Jewish Literature, as well as the 2019 memoir, The Art of Leaving, which won the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Best Memoir. Ayelet also teaches creative writing at universities in both Canada and Israel, and recently taught a prose writing workshop through the international school here at Tel Aviv University called Between Tel Aviv and the World. Welcome. I'm excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's great. Always very exciting for me to talk to a writer, and I always love to begin with the question of how you got into writing. So I know I've read your memoir, and it sounds like early on you were quite the prolific writer, and then it took you a while to come back to that place. So
Yeah, exactly. Thinking about, where it all started. It started before I even knew how to write. There was never, I was always a storyteller. I was always a writer, even before I could write. Before I knew the alphabet, I would tell stories and I would draw comics and, narrate them. So it's one of those things, and I know it's not like that for all writers, but for me, it kind of came built in, one of the things I was always sure about until I wasn't. And I think I became unsure about it because of, the insecurity of being 20 something and suddenly starting to think that it's not really a possible dream. And then the language thing, right? Moving to Canada when I was 25 kind of cemented the
worry.
Yeah, that, okay, now I definitely cannot do it, right? Because and I know some Israeli writers move abroad and continue to write in Hebrew, but I think for them it's usually, I may be wrong, I obviously did not do a study of it, but it seems like mostly they already have some sort of success as published authors, or maybe not. I just noted for me, because I wasn't speaking in Hebrew and I wasn't living in Hebrew, and back then Vancouver was where I moved to there were no Israelis in town.
Mm-hmm.
There were like 3,
Mm-hmm. You and 2 other people.
Yeah, so Hebrew was not, I say in my memoir, it was beside the point. It atrophied a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So it was partly about the circumstances of where you were when you decided to pursue writing again seriously, that English ended up being the language you went with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, your first book is a short story collection. And your second, I would say, is a bit more unconventional of a choice, in which you decided to write a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about that a little bit. Why a memoir?
When you said the word decided, I wanted to do like air quotations. I was like, decided. I'm like, because no one decides to write a memoir.
Okay. Okay.
It's such a, it's not a good choice.
So it just sort of came about naturally.
It's something
then.
I feel you kind of, it you feel the need to do it. It had to be told. The story had to be written. That's how it felt, anyway. And there was something about it too that and I don't know if that was kind of a justification afterwards, but it felt to me like such a, I say like it was the ultimate creative endeavor, because it was translating my life into art and into literature, And one day, much after it was, like long after it was published, it suddenly occurred to me too that, as a teen or as a kid, I always dreamt of being a character almost, like
Okay.
because I was so obsessed with books and I read everything in sight, and those characters were like my friends, and I felt very, embedded in that literary dream world. And I was like, oh, so I actually managed to fulfill my dream of becoming a literary character by writing a memoir. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like
Right.
I became a persona. I became a
So
yeah,
that childhood dream that you had when you were a little kid of you being a
yeah,
character came full
in a
circle.
book. Yeah.
Okay. I have so many follow-up questions. But before I get to them, maybe it's helpful for our listeners here. In your words, can you describe what The Art of Leaving is about?
Sure. So it's a memoir in essays. So it is comprised of essays, and it traces my life from childhood to motherhood. Um, and it deals with how grief and growing up with grief um, informed the choices that I made in my life. How growing up Mizrahi and Yemeni in Israel informed my life. And it's about leaving. It's about leaving Israel. It's about leaving my family. It's leaving my loved ones, and also leaving my language. Um,
Okay.
mhm.
Okay. So to get back to that idea you mentioned previously, it became sort of this activity of writing yourself into a literary sphere.
Yeah,
And memoir is such an interesting experiment for that, right? Because it's not. A lot of people think memoir is autobiography. It's
that's
just
right.
sort of your history and you're writing it down. But it's not. It's a combination of your history and your memories with sort of this creative license that you take in terms of how you want to present things and the
Sure.
type of story you want to tell. So did you think about that a lot, or was it just sort of naturally sort of came onto the paper?
I did think about it because by the time I realized that this is what I'm doing and this is what I'm writing, I've studied a lot. I took a lot of memoir classes, and I've read memoirs, and I've read essays, like creative nonfiction in general, not just the memoir form, but I love the personal essay form, or the memoir essay form, those short, I like short form. But I did realize, I always tell my students, there's no nonfiction police. No one's gonna, it's your ethical boundaries, it's your moral boundaries of how much you're willing to fictionalize. Personally, that's not what I want to do. If I don't remember something, I'm not going to invent it on the page. But the creativity, or the creative license, as you call it, or the liberties that you take, is in curating, and choosing what to include and what not to include. You are crafting a persona, you are crafting a character, and you are crafting a story from elements of your life and from elements of your personality that work to create a cohesive whole, and to serve what you're trying to impart and what you're trying to say.
Okay.
So that is the way that I see the creative liberty. And it's funny because people think like, oh, you're just laying it all bare on the page. And I'm like, mm-mm. This is very controlled.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in charge.
Mm-hmm.
I decided. I've had people ask me, really, there's more you haven't told us? I'm like, of course there's more. I'm like, I chose very carefully
Right.
what I'm telling you and what I'm sharing and what I'm choosing to share.
And
Um,
I think that's a part too when it comes to memoir. People kind of think this is everything here,
oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah, we know you.
We know you
Yeah.
exactly, but there are definitely, it's a conscious, and maybe not conscious for everyone, but there are decisions about what to put in and what to leave out.
Yeah, there's this term, the fictional dream, that John Gardner, who wrote books about craft, coined. And I think of that process as the non-fictional dream, the making the reader feel like they know you. That is the desired effect. I do want them to think, like I know this character, just like you would in a fiction, like in a novel, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
but also, still it's curated, right? So
Mm-hmm. So, not to bring social media into it, I know it's going to feel like a tangent, but everyone likes to joke if you didn't put it on social media, it didn't happen. And it reminds me a little bit of, I think, this idea with writing that I've heard people talk about where, when it comes to our real world, in some ways it feels like it didn't happen until we fictionalize it, until we tell it. And thinking about the art of leaving, and like you mentioned, one of the major themes is really about your own Mizrahi background, Yemeni background, and how you felt growing up. There wasn't that representation there. So was it really, really important for you to be a voice and to help contribute to that representation?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, absolutely. Like when I think about my book of short stories too, people ask questions about craft, and I always say there's a lot of mystery in the art of writing. It's not all, you know, uh, you can't explain everything. There are certain things. Why did I choose this point of view or that point of view? I don't know. The story demanded it. The character wanted to do that. Like from childhood, I remember the part where you write and suddenly you realize that this is going to happen. And you're like, oh my God, oh no, but I didn't want them to die.
Right. Right.
But that's
Right.
just what happens.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of mystery, and I love that. And that's part of the magic. But the part where I chose to populate the best place on earth with Mizrahi characters was not. Uh,
Just something that happened.
no,
Yeah.
it was calculated.
Okay.
I knew that I wanted to do that.
Okay.
I knew that that was my way of rectifying an experience that I had in childhood.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And how did it feel then when both books were published and received some press and attention, and maybe a related question to that, and you can say no too, but do you feel like you have a responsibility as an author a little bit, and do you feel like that was partly fulfilling that responsibility, or um, you can say no too, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, no, the reason that I'm hesitating is because I don't want to,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes I feel that I do. And then I feel like no. And then, you know what I mean? It's not like I just don't have a concrete answer to it.
Right.
I
Right.
feel like this is not something you have to do as a writer. And yet, like
It's important to you.
it is important to me.
Okay.
And I have been told by, elderly members of my community, like, oh, yeah, this is a mission, and you have to do this, and you have to write about that. And I kind of, balk against it. I'm like, but I don't want to, like I want to write what I want to write. And ultimately I do. I write what I want to write. But and it's especially harder. It was easier with the first book, right?
Okay.
Because you write and you don't know if anyone's going to ever read it.
Mm-hmm.
But once you have a book out and then you have a second book out, you're aware of the readership and you're aware of expectations, and it kind of sits a little bit like here, and you're like, no, I don't want to think about this.
Right. Well,
Shut
I
up.
imagine
I'm trying to do my thing here.
it can be hard, right? Because what you mentioned when you're working with characters, like it sounds like you really get into a flow and you don't exactly know what's going to end up happening with the character. And so the idea of responsibility sitting on your shoulder is kind of
It's
not helpful to
no,
that.
it's not.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's why like I'm hesitating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, one of what I love so much about your work is how beautifully you evoke and enliven places. So, Petah Tikva, Tel Aviv, Vancouver, Thailand, India. So, I'd love to ask you a little bit about that work. Is it hard to bring a place into literature?
Mm-hmm. first of all, thank you for saying that, because it's really important to me. And it's one of these elements of craft that I love. I love writing about place. I love evoking place. And I think it comes from being a traveler and from being an immigrant. You're more aware, I think, of places. You see your own home and where you come from in a different eyes when you lived away for long enough. Suddenly you notice things that you may have not noticed if you just lived there your whole life. So that kind of awareness of places just heightened, I feel, for people who travel and for people who have migrated. And I guess also just being a writer, because, you just see everything, you notice everything.
Okay.
But I never felt that it was hard.
Okay.
For me, it just kind of came naturally. But then I realized later that it is something that I would like to mine and be able to teach.
Okay.
So I've started paying attention to what it is that exactly I do. And
Okay.
now I speak a lot about that.
Well,
and
I want to
teach
hear
a
about
lot.
that if you don't mind.
It's like I can lecture about place and about writing place for hours.
Okay.
Seriously, so I'm not
Okay,
going to do
maybe
that.
not the hour version.
So I'm not going to do that.
but
But I'm going to give you one. And of course, like the sensory details, I think that's, everyone who writes knows about that. But I want to say one thing that I find that is probably the most important thing about writing place is being aware that it is always seen from the point of view of someone.
Okay.
That it's never neutral. Place is never neutral.
Okay.
It's always a mirror of emotion. It's always, because you know how it is, like the same sunset through even your eyes, the same character would look different on one day, and then it would look different on another day. Because if you're in a good mood, it might be all like, beautiful gelato colors in the sky. And if you're in a bad mood, it's bleeding over the skyscrapers, right? So I think that is probably the most important thing to remember. It's never a postcard,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
It's always seen through someone's eyes.
Now, for me as a reader, what happens when I read your work, other work, Tel Aviv isn't the same because now I have your representation of Tel Aviv in my mind too. So is there a power in that? Because you're reflecting place through the eyes of characters, but you're also sort of creating something new and adding a layer to the meaning of a place.
It makes me think about how writing a memoir messes with your memories.
Okay.
I know he takes
Okay.
it somewhere else, but it just made me think, because once you wrote it, it is suddenly becomes the memory almost,
Okay.
right?
Right.
So, if it's, yeah, just like when you retell a story, right? So you're kind of renovating it a little bit.
I feel like, that's kind of natural too. Like it reminds me of, when you have childhood memories and you talk to a sibling and they're like, no,
That's not how it happened.
happened that way. And then you're
Yeah.
kind of like, oh yeah. And so it's hard to know
Mhm.
what is actually your memory and
Yeah.
what is the
Yeah.
evocation of a place, I guess, or a time that,
But I love the idea that I'm adding to the body of work around Tel Aviv. It's like my favorite city, and yeah,
yeah.
I really like that idea.
Yeah. Do you feel like Tel Aviv and maybe Israel means something in particular in your writing?
It's not. It can't be distilled yet, I don't think. It's just so much. Ultimately, Israel is home. Messy and infuriating, and beautiful and terrible and all of that. I can't get away from it, obviously. Here I am, I'm back. 20 years, I lived abroad and now I'm here. So if I have to distill it, this is it.
Okay.
Home, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, I realize it's a bit of an unfair question because a place can mean so many things. But one thing I picked up on your writing with Canada, because that's again where I'm from, is, and I've noticed it in, I don't know, do you know Mizrahi Silkoff? She has a wonderful short story called Chez l'Arabe, and she presents Canada in a little bit of a similar way in which it's a space of reconciliation. Um, so I don't know if you've picked up on that, if that's sort of unique to Canada, representing Canada in some ways, if it's the idea of just being in a space that isn't Israel.
I think it is significant that it's Canada. I don't think it's any place would have had the same effect on me. I think for me personally, it felt Canada was a little bit of an. I'm nervous about using the wrong word, so please tell me if I'm using the wrong word. I am ESL.
Well, your English is amazing.
I know,
so don't worry.
but I'm just saying it does
Okay.
happen
Okay.
sometimes,
That's
or I
fair.
mispronounce things.
Yeah.
It feels like it was a bit of an antidote.
Okay. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
me, when at that time, not only I came from a very intense place, but also I was a very intense person. It's funny for me now, even though it's been so long now that I was gone and back, that people in Israel find me, calm or polite, and I'm like, this is Canada. That's what Canada did to me. Because when I came there, I was all fire. And it wasn't always, it didn't feel like positive at the time.
Okay.
I had yeah, Canada helped in that sense. There was something very calming about it. And by the way, it wasn't just Canada, it was a process. It was India first.
Okay.
India helped
Okay.
with that. And then Canada, there was something very, positive, helpful
Okay.
for me at the time.
Okay.
And even more specifically, maybe BC,
Okay.
the West Coast,
Right. Right.
I would say.
Yeah. They're probably the most laid back out of all Canadians.
Yeah,
So-
exactly. It was a shock.
Mhm.
It was a shock, but I needed it.
Mhm. One of the moments in your memoir that really struck me was you talk about an attack that happened to you on a bus in Vancouver. And you make note of the fact that no one really came to help you,
Yeah.
and that wouldn't happen here.
Yeah.
And that was something that really, really struck me. And I don't disagree with you in a way. It's a very, very laid back place, but there's almost sometimes a bit of an apathy that comes with that.
Yeah.
Do you pick up on that too, or?
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like nowhere is perfect. and I remember, like, if we go back to that story, the way that I said that, and I remember I was talking to a Lebanese friend, so I think that's meaningful because he said back there or back home, and for him he was kind of like, putting both of our countries together, and he was right. But I said jokingly, well, back home, if I get on a bus, it might explode, right? So I guess getting beaten up is not so bad.
Right.
Right. And then he said, yeah, but back home people would have helped you.
Yeah.
So he kind of, I first of all, I love that he saw that, that in many ways Israel and Lebanon are the same. But also there is the other piece of it, that there was a time where it was very dangerous to get on a bus in Israel. So yeah, it's
Okay. In the art of leaving, a lot of it is about leaving and about being in different countries and thinking about Israel and home in relation to where you are at a particular time and place in your life. So, Do you recommend that as a practice for a writer to get outside of what is a familiar and maybe talk a little bit about how that shaped you?
Yeah, I can't imagine my life otherwise. I've always wanted to go, but also I can't separate. And again, that's something that I also say in my memoir. I can't separate that from all the other what ifs that abound in my life. Right? I connected to my father dying. At the age of 10. I feel like if things were different, I don't know if I would have. I don't know how much of it is innate and how much of it is the circumstances of my life.
Okay.
I do think that you have to live
Hmm.
to be a writer, you know. Yeah, loudly and I mean, I think everyone does.
Okay.
But I sometimes, especially after I realized something about leaving that I couldn't see. I compare it a little bit to childbirth. It's one of those things that even if people would have told me, I probably wouldn't have listened and I wouldn't have gotten it.
Okay.
But that fracture, that wound, that leaving causes is not something that I could have predicted. Um, yeah, that it's not easy, is what I'm trying to say. And it becomes harder. Like if I came back within the first 5 years or so, I probably would have been able to just kind of like slide back into that seat at the table.
Hmm.
But because I was gone for 20 years, coming back was another fracture. It was another immigration.
Hmm.
It wasn't a return.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so I guess I could see now in retrospect the value in staying
Okay. Okay.
as well.
Okay. In the memoir, anyway, you portray coming back as sort of a coming into your own in terms of your your Yemeni cultural identity, understanding of your family, your grandmother, her history. So, do you feel like that was part literary technique, or do you feel that was really sort of the journey that you've taken in your life?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. It was the form and the way the memoir is structured is based, that came second.
Okay.
The life came first. You know what I mean? And finding like dressing it in that kind of structure was because of you know it was the content or the life that dictated that.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the memoir, it's before I actually returned home. The return home came after I finished the memoir. So it's not in the book itself, but it was that metaphorical return,
Okay.
right? The return to my my father's poetry and to my mom's cooking and to the Yemeni identity and all of these things that I snubbed as a teen. And I think that's common, like we don't want anything to do with it. It feels too diasporic. It feels too like, we just want to move away from our ancestry and our parents. I
Hmm.
think that's just a common thing, but I think it is also particularly a Mizrahi predicament, more so, I would say. Um, but yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but
Hmm.
yeah, I think it was actually being away for after about a decade or so that I started to feel some sort of a yearning and a
Okay.
thirst because I was alone, because I was in a place where no one spoke Hebrew, because I felt really afloat and I kind of sought some roots
Okay.
and some connection.
Okay. Okay. Now, earlier you described going away and coming back as an immigration anew.
Hmm.
A second, it wasn't just returning to Israel, Petah Tikva, Tel Aviv. It was immigrating here again.
Yeah.
Um, so was that partly because you were a different person, or do you feel like here is different from the Israel you originally left?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
Yeah, both. 20 years is a lifetime. Israel changed. I changed. I came back with a partner, with a child. I came back with a Canadian sensibility in me, you know. And if in Canada I was too Israeli, then I come here and I'm too Canadian. You're so polite. I'm like, I'm not polite. I'm rude and obnoxious. Can't you tell?
I'm working on my rude and obnoxious. I have to admit.
So it was, and even more interesting is to suddenly watch my partner and my child, who was born in Canada, and I felt even a little bit of guilt. I'm like, oh no, now I'm like inflicting them with my, my immigration or my immigrant wound, by bringing them here and watching them having to adjust and watching them having to long. And that was weird to watch.
Okay. I mean, it can be described as a wound, but I think it's an opportunity as well too, right? To move to a new place. And do you feel like your writing has sort of shifted your view of the world?
If it shifted, sorry?
Your view of the world.
I think there's always learning in the writing. Yeah.
Okay.
Like it's on one hand you're there and you're alone in a room, but on the other hand you're trying to access other people's point of views and other people's hearts and other people's minds, and that is bound to open you up. And that's the hope that the hope is that it would do it to others, to readers, right? Create empathy and show us something from someone else's eyes.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of creating empathy from someone else's eyes, are you working on anything new these days?
Yeah. I'm actually like very close to finishing edits for a novel.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. I have to send it at the end of the month.
Okay. Good luck.
Can anyone see my face?
Right. I know it's probably a pretty stressful period right now, finishing everything up.
It is, yeah. But it's exciting too.
So 3 major works of literature, 3 different genres.
I know.
So do you feel like working on a novel was a whole other adventure compared to the memoir?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, because the memoir, even though it's like, it was published as a memoir, but it, like I said, it is built of small pieces. It's built of essays or stories. So in that sense, there was some similarities between that and the first book. I found the novel just so big and unwieldy, and I was like, I don't know how to hold this, like. So that was
okay.
I found that very intimidating and challenging.
Okay. And was it a process of exploration? Did you just sort of figure it out as you went along? Did you have to plan a lot?
No, not too much.
Okay.
Like it doesn't work for me. I know every writer is different. I can't do it. I can't have it be too structured, because then there's no surprises. Like, like that character doing that thing you didn't think they were going to do, and you're like, oh no,
right,
what is happening? That's, if you have it all planned out very carefully, I don't see how that can happen. So I need to allow for some freedom.
Okay.
So, but on the other hand, if a short story is completely free, usually, like I may have some idea of how it would end. But usually it's just kind of like a process of exploration as you write. With a novel, for me personally, I couldn't have it be entirely open. So I kind of eventually landed on something in between where I have like some spots, some anchors or some moments within the narrative that I knew I had to write toward.
Okay.
You know, I'm like, I want this to happen at some point. I want that to happen in another junction. Like, you know, like,
Right. Okay.
and it still can be, you know, flexible somewhat, but that's kind of how I did that.
So to use business speak, you have benchmarks.
Okay, benchmarks. Thank you.
Benchmarks you had to hit at different times.
Okay.
Yeah. Am I allowed to ask what the novel's about?
It's so funny. I'm not trained in talking about it, you know. So I'm like, I don't know what to say yet.
Okay.
I can say that it takes place in the 90s.
Okay.
Which apparently is a historical novel.
I know. Like the music too. I know. That was a weird moment for me when you realized that.
I'm like, what? And also the 50s, which is like the Ma'abara times, you know.
I feel comfortable with that being historical.
Oh, yeah.
That period.
Yeah, that's definitely historical.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. Do you have a title yet, or?
I have one, but we're not sure that it's the one yet.
Okay. So to be determined.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, congratulations. That's a huge milestone, obviously, to finish it and be at the moment where it's final comments. So, yeah, I can't wait to take a look when it's published.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I have to thank you for being here today, too, and talking about writing and giving some insight into your work and the writing process, too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a great time.